The moment Karen's Lexus sank into the middle of my lawn, spraying mud and sprinkler water in every direction, I knew 3 months of patience had finally paid off. The sound came first that morning, a deep metallic scrape followed by the frantic whine of tires spinning on wet soil. I was already standing on my front porch with a cup of black coffee warming my hands, watching the scene unfold like the final act of a movie I'd been patiently directing for weeks. The early Texas air smelled like damp grass and fresh dirt, that rich earthy scent you only get right before sunrise when the neighborhood is still quiet. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and if there's one thing you should know about me, it's that I've spent the last 20 years working as a professional landscape contractor. Lawns, irrigation systems, soil drainage, root structures. I understand how land behaves the way a mechanic understands engines. Every inch of the yard in front of me had been planted, leveled, and cared for by my own hands. It wasn't just grass. It was hours of grading soil, installing proper irrigation lines, and laying down the kind of turf that takes real work to keep healthy, which made it all the more irritating when someone decided it was their personal shortcut. 3 months earlier, the first set of tire tracks appeared. 2 clean stripes pressed straight across the center of my lawn, cutting from the road on the east side directly toward the street uphill. At first I thought maybe someone had made a wrong turn. Maybe a delivery driver. But the next morning the same tracks appeared again, fresh grooves pressed into the dew-covered grass, like someone tracing the same line with a ruler. It didn't take long to figure out who it was. Linda Whitmore lived 2 houses up the hill and sat on the HOA board like she'd been elected mayor of the entire neighborhood. Blonde hair, always perfect, oversized sunglasses, and a white Lexus SUV that gleamed so bright in the sun it practically announced her arrival before the engine even turned the corner. The road curved gently around my property, maybe an extra 30 seconds of driving if you followed it properly. But Linda preferred the faster route, straight across my yard. The first time I approached her about it, she smiled the kind of polite smile that never quite reaches the eyes. "Oh, Ethan," she said lightly, waving one manicured hand like the whole conversation was adorable. "It's just grass. Just grass." That phrase stuck in my head for weeks. Because the funny thing about people who say something is just grass is that they've usually never spent a single Saturday afternoon repairing a damaged lawn. I tried everything at first. A small wooden sign that said private property. The next morning it had been knocked sideways. I added decorative landscaping stones along the edge of the lawn. Her Lexus simply curved around them like they were decorative suggestions. Then one afternoon, a neatly printed envelope from the HOA appeared in my mailbox. Landscaping obstruction notice. Apparently my attempt to stop someone from driving across my own property was interfering with community traffic flow. Community traffic flow. Across my yard. That was the moment I stopped arguing and started paying attention. Because once you work with land long enough, you begin to notice patterns. And Linda Whitmore had a very predictable one. Every morning between 7:10 and 7:15 a.m., she cut across the exact same line of grass like rails on a train track. Same entry point. Same exit point. Same careless confidence. And the more I watched those tire marks appear day after day, the more one simple idea started forming in my mind. Linda Whitmore thought she had discovered a shortcut. What she didn't realize was that she had actually drawn me a perfect blueprint. Once you start noticing patterns in soil, it becomes impossible to ignore them. That line across my yard had become as clear as a survey marker. Every morning Linda Whitmore's Lexus rolled down the hill, cut across the exact same strip of grass, and climbed back onto the street like she had discovered a private highway that nobody else was smart enough to use. The first few weeks I kept hoping she would eventually stop. People sometimes do the right thing once they realize they are being watched. Linda was not one of those people. If anything, she seemed more comfortable each time she drove across the lawn, like the repeated tracks were slowly turning my property into something she considered shared space. The sound of her tires became familiar, a soft crunch followed by the gentle hum of an expensive engine. Sometimes I would hear it from inside the house while pouring my morning coffee. Other times I would catch it while loading tools into my truck for work. Every time the same 2 curved tracks appeared in the grass, flattening the blades that I had spent an entire weekend planting and leveling earlier that spring. People think grass is tough because it grows everywhere, but good lawn grass is delicate when it is young. Each pass of those tires compressed the soil underneath, squeezing the air pockets out of the ground. Without those air pockets, the roots struggle. Without strong roots, the lawn weakens. A landscape contractor learns these things the way a doctor learns anatomy. Soil structure matters. Water flow matters. Pressure points matter. That is why I started studying the ground like it was a blueprint. Early one morning, I walked out before sunrise with a measuring tape and a small metal flag marker. The dew clung to the grass and soaked through my boots while I traced the tire marks inch by inch. 23 feet from the curb to the exit point near the hill. The same angle every day. The same shallow dip in the center where the weight of the vehicle pressed hardest into the earth. The smell of damp soil filled the cool air as I knelt down and ran my fingers through the grass blades. Compacted soil underneath. Exactly where I expected it. Linda Whitmore was not just cutting across my lawn. She was training the ground to behave a certain way. That is what repeated pressure does to land. It creates memory. And once land develops memory, a person who understands landscaping can shape that memory into something useful. Over the next week, I stopped putting up signs. I stopped moving decorative rocks. I even stopped looking annoyed whenever her Lexus crossed the yard. If anything, I began acting like I did not notice it anymore. Linda waved once while passing through like she was greeting a neighbor from a public road. I smiled and waved back. Inside the garage, I began pulling out equipment most homeowners would not recognize. Trenching shovel, soil auger, irrigation connectors. Nothing unusual for someone in my line of work. Just the normal tools used to reshape ground conditions beneath a lawn. The interesting thing about irrigation systems is that they rely on small channels hidden beneath the surface. Channels that guide water exactly where you want it to go. If you place them carefully, the ground above them can behave very differently from the rest of the yard. Strong in some places, soft in others, controlled entirely by the way moisture moves through the soil. And Linda Whitmore had already done the hardest part for me. She had mapped the exact route herself. Once the plan started forming in my mind, patience became the most important tool I had. Landscaping is not about force. It is about timing, pressure, and understanding how water changes everything. Over the next several days, I began preparing the ground beneath that narrow strip of lawn Linda had been using like a private driveway. I waited until late afternoon when the sun dipped behind the houses and the neighborhood quieted down. The smell of cut grass still hung in the warm air as I pulled a trenching shovel from the back of my truck and walked slowly across the yard, following the same path her tires had carved over the past 3 months. 23 feet. The measurement had already burned itself into my mind. I pressed the shovel into the soil and began cutting a narrow irrigation trench just beneath the surface, careful to keep the grass layer intact so the lawn still looked perfectly normal from above. That is the trick most people never think about. The surface can remain smooth while everything underneath changes. I worked slowly, moving a few feet each evening so nothing about my yard looked unusual to anyone passing by. By the end of the week, a hidden channel ran beneath the exact center of Linda Whitmore's favorite shortcut. I connected that channel to the irrigation manifold already installed along the side of the house. As a contractor, I had installed dozens of systems like it for clients all over the county. Water pressure regulators, flexible lines, soil saturation valves. All of it completely standard equipment. But this time the purpose was a little more creative. Instead of distributing water evenly across the lawn, the new line would concentrate moisture in a very specific location directly beneath the tire path she had been reinforcing for months. Moist soil behaves very differently from dry soil. It loses strength. It shifts under weight. Anyone who has ever stepped into a muddy patch knows the feeling of the ground suddenly giving way under their foot. A 200-pound person might sink an inch. A 6,000-pound sport utility vehicle can sink a lot more. The following morning, I stood inside the garage with the door cracked open just enough to watch the street. The faint hum of early traffic drifted down the hill. Birds chirped somewhere in the trees lining the sidewalk. At exactly 7:12, the white Lexus appeared at the corner like it always did. The sunlight reflected off the windshield as Linda turned the wheel without hesitation and rolled straight toward the lawn. The tires crossed the grass with the same careless confidence I had been watching for weeks. The ground held firm that morning because I had not activated anything yet. This was still observation, still preparation, still patience. Her vehicle climbed back onto the road and disappeared around the curve while the lawn remained smooth and quiet behind her. A few minutes later, I walked out and examined the soil where the tires had passed. The weight had pressed directly into the softened zone I had prepared, exactly where I needed it. I could feel the difference beneath my boots. Slightly damp, slightly loose, controlled. Over the next several days, I continued adjusting the irrigation timing, allowing just enough water to collect underground while keeping the grass surface looking healthy and untouched. Anyone standing on the sidewalk would see nothing unusual at all, just a well-maintained yard in a quiet suburban neighborhood. But below that green surface, the soil was slowly transforming into something far less stable. Linda Whitmore continued driving across it every morning, completely unaware that the ground beneath her favorite shortcut was no longer the same lawn she had been ignoring for months. And the longer she followed that path, the more perfectly she reinforced the exact spot where the soil would eventually respond. By the second week, the ground beneath that narrow strip of lawn had completely changed character. From the sidewalk, everything still looked perfect. The grass stood upright, green and healthy, gently swaying whenever the breeze rolled through the neighborhood. But underneath that calm surface, the soil had become something entirely different. Moisture had been carefully redirected through the irrigation channel I installed, slowly saturating the exact section of ground where Linda Whitmore's Lexus placed the most pressure every morning. The trick was balance. Too much water, and the grass would discolor. Too little, and the soil would remain firm. Landscaping is a quiet science. You learn how to read the earth the way a sailor reads tides. I adjusted the irrigation timer every evening after work, kneeling beside the valve box with a small flashlight while crickets chirped in the distance. 10 minutes of water flow at midnight. Another short cycle just before sunrise. Enough to keep the ground below the surface soft without ever letting the lawn above reveal what was happening underneath. Each morning the same routine continued. Around 7:12 the white Lexus appeared at the top of the hill, engine humming with that smooth, expensive sound luxury vehicles make when they glide through quiet neighborhoods. Linda never slowed down. She did not hesitate. The tires rolled straight across the lawn like they belonged there. The faint crunch of grass bending beneath the wheels had become so familiar I could recognize it even from inside the kitchen. Coffee mug in my hand, sunlight spilling across the counter, I would hear the tires press through the damp grass and disappear back onto the road 30 feet away. She even waved once again while driving across, like the yard had become some kind of shared community pathway. I waved back politely. That is another thing people misunderstand about patience. Sometimes the calmest reaction is the one that allows someone else to keep making the same mistake long enough for consequences to arrive naturally. Over the next several mornings, I stepped out onto the lawn after she left and examined the soil carefully. The center section had become exactly what I needed. Soft enough to shift under heavy weight, but stable enough that a normal person walking across it would notice nothing unusual. I pressed my boot gently into the ground and watched the surface compress slightly before returning to shape. Perfect. The soil had developed what contractors call a pressure pocket, a zone where repeated weight weakens the structure beneath the surface until the ground begins to behave more like damp clay than compacted turf. And Linda Whitmore had helped create it herself. Every pass of her vehicle reinforced the exact conditions I needed. Meanwhile, the rest of the yard remained firm and healthy. Sprinkler heads rotated quietly each night across the rest of the lawn, sending thin arcs of water through the moonlight, while the hidden line beneath her shortcut continued preparing the center zone. The smell of wet earth lingered faintly in the morning air whenever the sun rose. It looked like a normal suburban lawn, but anyone who understood soil would recognize that something underneath had changed. Late one evening, I stood on the porch again, watching the quiet street. The sky had turned deep blue and porch lights flickered on across the neighborhood. Somewhere down the block a dog barked once and then settled. I held the small irrigation remote in my hand and glanced toward the line of grass that had become Linda Whitmore's favorite route. The ground was ready now. The pressure pocket had matured exactly the way I expected. All that remained was timing. And if there was one thing Linda Whitmore had proven over the past 3 months, it was that her morning routine never changed. The morning everything finally happened began the same way every other morning had for months, quiet and predictable. The sky had just started turning pale orange above the rooftops when I stepped onto the front porch with a fresh cup of coffee. The air still carried that cool early morning chill that disappears once the sun climbs higher. A faint smell of damp soil lingered across the lawn from the irrigation cycle that had finished about 30 minutes earlier. Everything looked perfectly normal. The grass stood evenly trimmed, bright green in the morning light, stretching across the yard like a well-kept carpet. If someone walked past on the sidewalk, they would never suspect that anything beneath it had changed. But I knew exactly what was waiting under that narrow strip of lawn. The soil was ready. The pressure pocket had reached the point where one more heavy pass would make the ground react the way I expected. I leaned against the porch railing and glanced toward the street at the top of the hill. My watch read 7:10. Linda Whitmore was nothing if not consistent. 2 minutes later, I heard the familiar sound drifting down the road. A low, smooth engine hum followed by the faint whisper of tires rolling over pavement. Right on schedule. The white Lexus appeared around the curve exactly the way it had every weekday morning for the past 3 months. Sunlight reflected off the windshield as she turned the wheels slightly and guided the vehicle off the road and toward the lawn without even slowing down. That small moment always amazed me. Most drivers hesitate when leaving pavement. Linda never did. Confidence can be a powerful thing when someone believes the ground beneath them will always behave the same way it did yesterday. The front tires rolled onto the grass with the usual soft crunch. The suspension dipped slightly as the vehicle crossed the curb edge and moved toward the familiar path that cut straight across my yard. I took a slow sip of coffee and watched carefully. The first half of the shortcut went exactly like every other morning. The tires pressed into the grass. The vehicle glided forward. Then the front wheels reached the center section where the soil had been quietly transforming for weeks. At first, nothing looked different. The Lexus continued moving forward the same way it always did. Then the ground beneath the left tire shifted. It was subtle, almost invisible, just a slight downward dip that most drivers would not notice immediately. But heavy vehicles respond quickly to changes in support. The front end of the SUV lowered another inch as the soil compressed under the weight. A soft, wet sound followed, the kind of thick squish you hear when stepping into damp clay after a rainstorm. The tire spun for a moment and then settled deeper. Linda's brake lights flashed red as she stopped the vehicle abruptly in the middle of the lawn. For a second, everything went completely quiet except for the faint ticking sound of the engine idling. The Lexus leaned slightly forward where the softened soil had given way beneath the front wheels. Not dramatically, not dangerously, just enough that the tires were now sitting in a shallow depression of damp earth. I set the coffee mug down on the porch railing and folded my arms, watching calmly as the driver door opened and Linda Whitmore stepped out onto the grass for the first time since she had started using my yard as her shortcut. For a few seconds, Linda Whitmore just stood there beside the driver door, staring down at the front of her Lexus like the ground had personally offended her. The early sunlight reflected off the polished white paint while the vehicle rested awkwardly in the shallow depression forming beneath the front tires. One heel pressed into the grass and sank slightly into the damp soil. She lifted her foot quickly and looked down with visible confusion. From the porch, I could hear the faint suction sound of wet earth releasing her shoe. It was the exact reaction I expected from someone who had never actually stepped onto the section of lawn she had been driving across every morning. The difference between looking at land and feeling it beneath your weight can be surprising when the ground is holding more water than usual. Linda circled the front of the vehicle slowly, examining the tires now resting in the softened soil. The front left wheel had settled a few inches deeper than the right, which gave the entire vehicle a subtle forward lean. Nothing dangerous, nothing dramatic, just enough to keep the tires from finding solid traction again. The kind of situation any tow truck driver sees every day when vehicles wander off pavement and onto ground that cannot support their weight. Linda climbed back into the driver's seat and pressed the accelerator gently. The engine revved with a smooth mechanical growl, and the front tires rotated. Instead of climbing out of the shallow depression, the tires simply churned the wet soil beneath them, polishing the inside of the small pocket until the ground became even softer. A quiet spinning sound followed, like rubber sliding over clay. The vehicle shifted perhaps half an inch before settling again. She stopped immediately. Anyone who understands vehicles knows that continuing to spin the tires would only dig the wheels deeper. For a moment, she sat there gripping the steering wheel, looking straight ahead through the windshield, as if the lawn might suddenly decide to cooperate again. From my position on the porch, I could see her shoulders rise and fall in a slow breath. Then she opened the door once more and stepped back onto the grass. This time, both heels pressed slightly into the damp section of soil, leaving narrow impressions where she stood. She glanced toward the house and finally noticed me watching from the porch railing. I gave a small polite nod. "Good morning, Linda," I said calmly. The air still carried the scent of wet earth and fresh grass clippings from the previous afternoon. She brushed a strand of hair away from her face and forced a tight smile that looked very different from the casual wave she used to give while driving. "Across the yard. Ethan," she said, glancing back toward the Lexus. "Your lawn seems unusually soft this morning." I stepped down from the porch and walked slowly toward the edge of the grass, careful to stay on the firm section near the walkway. "Irrigation cycle finished earlier than usual," I replied. "Soil can hold a lot of moisture depending on drainage. Landscaping conditions change sometimes." Linda looked again at the shallow depression surrounding the front tires, then back at me. The confidence she carried every morning while cutting across the yard had quietly faded, replaced by the cautious expression of someone realizing the shortcut they had relied on might not be as reliable as they assumed. For a moment, Linda Whitmore said nothing. She simply stared at the shallow depression surrounding the front tires of her Lexus like the ground had betrayed some silent agreement she believed existed. The engine continued idling with a low mechanical hum while the vehicle leaned forward just enough to make the situation obvious. Not dramatic, not dangerous, just inconvenient. The kind of inconvenience that appears when a vehicle leaves pavement and meets soil that was never designed to carry several thousand pounds of weight. Linda folded her arms and glanced again at the lawn around the tires. The grass looked perfectly normal except for the narrow pocket where the ground had compressed beneath the front axle. Morning sunlight reflected off the dew still clinging to the blades. Everything appeared calm and quiet, almost peaceful, except for the fact that her luxury sport utility vehicle was now resting several inches deeper into the earth than it had been a few minutes earlier. She turned toward me again. "Ethan," she said slowly, "your irrigation system seems to have made this section unusually soft." I walked a few steps closer, but stayed on the firm part of the yard near the stone walkway. "Irrigation systems move water where the soil allows it to travel," I replied evenly. "Ground conditions can change when a lot of weight keeps pressing on the same area every day." Linda glanced back toward the tires again. One of the front wheels had settled just enough that the sidewall pressed gently against the damp soil surrounding it. The vehicle would not roll forward easily now without outside help. She took a few careful steps around the front bumper, testing the grass with each step like she suddenly expected the lawn to behave differently everywhere she walked. Only the center section felt soft. The rest of the yard remained firm and healthy. Finally, she exhaled and looked up the hill toward the street she normally rejoined after crossing my yard. The paved road sat less than 30 feet away, close enough to reach with a normal drive, much farther when your vehicle is sitting in a shallow pocket of damp earth. "I suppose I will need a tow truck," she said quietly. "That would probably be the safest solution," I answered. "Vehicles this heavy can settle deeper if the tires keep spinning." She nodded once, clearly realizing that point on her own earlier. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. While she dialed, I stood quietly near the edge of the walkway, listening to the faint breeze moving through the trees lining the street. A lawn sprinkler 2 houses down clicked softly as it rotated, sending thin arcs of water across another yard. The neighborhood had begun waking up. A pickup truck rolled slowly past the corner at the top of the hill before disappearing down the next street. After a short conversation, Linda ended the call and slipped the phone back into her purse. "Tow service says about 20 minutes, she said. "That sounds reasonable," I replied. She looked down at the ground again, studying the narrow strip of grass that had slowly transformed into a pressure pocket beneath months of repeated tire tracks. The realization seemed to settle across her expression like morning fog lifting from the yard. "I guess I should have used the road," she said quietly. "The road usually works better for vehicles," I answered. For the first time since I moved into the neighborhood, Linda Whitmore did not argue with that. The tow truck arrived exactly 22 minutes later, rumbling slowly down the hill with the deep diesel sound that carries through quiet neighborhoods like distant thunder. The driver stepped out wearing a faded blue work shirt and a baseball cap, squinting at the situation before he even reached the lawn. He walked halfway across the grass, boots pressing into the firm section near the curb before stopping where the soil softened beneath his weight. He glanced at the front tires of the Lexus, then at the narrow depression in the ground that had formed beneath them. The man let out a low whistle that sounded almost impressed. "Happens more than people think," he said, nodding toward the vehicle. "Heavy sport utility vehicles and soft soil do not mix very well." Linda stood beside the car with her arms folded, watching him inspect the tires. The driver crouched down, pressing his fingers lightly into the damp earth near the front wheel. The soil shifted easily under the pressure of his hand. "Saturated ground," he said matter-of-factly. "Probably been driven over the same spot for a while. That compresses the structure underneath." He stood up again and glanced toward me, standing near the walkway. "This your lawn, sir?" "Yes," I said calmly. "The irrigation system runs through that section of yard. Soil conditions can change depending on moisture levels." The driver nodded like someone who had seen similar situations many times before. "That explains it. Once the ground gets soft enough, the weight of the vehicle just settles into the pocket. Not stuck badly, though. We will pull it out without trouble." He walked back toward the truck and began lowering the steel ramp with a loud metallic clank that echoed softly through the neighborhood. The winch cable unspooled with a slow clicking sound as he guided it across the lawn toward the front axle of the Lexus. Linda stepped aside quietly while he attached the hook point beneath the vehicle. The driver returned to the truck controls, and the winch motor hummed to life with a steady mechanical whir. Slowly the cable tightened, and the vehicle began inching forward out of the shallow depression. Wet soil released the tires with a thick squelching sound as the Lexus rolled carefully toward the curb. Within less than a minute the front wheels reached the firm pavement again and the vehicle rested level on the street. The driver disconnected the cable and wiped his hands on a cloth rag. "You are good to go," he said. "Just avoid driving across soft ground like that again." Linda nodded quietly. She thanked him, signed the service receipt, and climbed back into the driver's seat. Before starting the engine, she glanced once more at the strip of lawn she had been crossing every morning. The grass there now held two deep, curved impressions where the tires had settled into the damp earth. For the first time since I moved into the neighborhood, Linda Whitmore did not attempt to drive across the yard again. Instead, the Lexus rolled forward along the actual road, following the pavement as it curved gently up the hill and disappeared around the corner. The lawn grew quiet again. I walked out onto the grass after the tow truck left and examined the soil carefully. The pressure pocket had done exactly what it was supposed to do. The ground had responded to the repeated weight placed upon it until the soil structure changed. That is how land works. It remembers pressure, and sometimes it teaches people the same lesson. The next morning the neighborhood felt different in a quiet, almost subtle way that only someone paying attention would notice. The sun rose over the same rooftops, the same sprinklers clicked on across nearby lawns, and the same early commuters rolled slowly through the subdivision streets. But when 7:12 arrived, something that had become routine for 3 months did not happen. There was no white Lexus turning off the pavement, no tires crossing the grass, no soft crunch of wheels pressing into the lawn outside my porch. Instead, I watched the vehicle appear at the top of the hill and remain exactly where it belonged, rolling smoothly along the curve of the road like every other car in the neighborhood. The difference was small, but it meant everything. Linda Whitmore drove past my house on the street without even glancing toward the yard. The shortcut had quietly disappeared overnight. Over the next few days, the grass began recovering from the months of pressure. Healthy turf is resilient when it is given the chance to breathe again. The soil slowly released the compressed sections beneath the surface, while fresh growth started filling the shallow impressions left behind by the Lexus tires. I adjusted the irrigation cycle back to its normal pattern, allowing the ground to dry and stabilize. Within a week, the lawn looked exactly the way it had before the first tire tracks ever appeared. Bright green, evenly trimmed, and undisturbed. A few neighbors had heard about the tow truck visit. In quiet neighborhoods, news travels faster than people realize. One afternoon, Mr. Callahan from 2 houses down walked by while I was trimming the edge near the sidewalk. He glanced across the yard and chuckled softly. "Heard someone tried to make your lawn into a driveway," he said. "Something like that," I replied with a small smile. He nodded toward the street where cars passed normally along the pavement. Roads usually work better for vehicles anyway. That simple sentence carried more truth than most HOA meetings ever managed to accomplish. A few days later, I saw Linda again while checking the mailbox at the end of the driveway. She approached from the sidewalk, walking carefully along the concrete path instead of across the grass. For a moment, we both stood there with the late afternoon sun reflecting off the quiet street behind us. She cleared her throat slightly. "Ethan," she said, "your lawn looks good again." "Thank you," I answered. "Soil recovers when people stop driving on it." She gave a small nod, the kind people give when they understand a lesson without needing it explained further. Since that morning with the tow truck, not a single tire has crossed the yard again. The grass grows the way it was meant to grow, the irrigation system waters the soil the way it was designed to, and the road continues carrying vehicles exactly where roads were always supposed to carry them. The funny thing about land is that it does not argue. It simply responds to pressure, moisture, and time. And if someone ignores those rules long enough, the ground eventually reminds them.